They didn't write them on napkins. They didn't write them at all. These recipes lived in hands, in the way a woman's wrist moved over a pot, in the smell of a kitchen on a Tuesday morning, in a four-room apartment in Hell's Kitchen. Irish immigrant grandmothers crossed the Atlantic with almost nothing, and they fed families of 8 on pennies a day. 30 meals, 30 secrets, gone from almost every American kitchen. We're bringing them back right now. Number 30, white pudding. A sausage made without blood, the humbler, quieter cousin of black pudding, made when blood was scarce or when the children at the table refused the dark version and needed something they would eat without a fight. Pork meat and fat, chopped fine or ground, combined with oatmeal, diced onion, salt, and white pepper, packed into a natural casing and either poached gently in water or sliced and fried in a pan until the outside blistered and the inside stayed dense and savory and faintly sweet from the oat. Irish immigrant butchers in Boston and New York were making white pudding by the 1880s, often sold alongside drysheen and black pudding from the same counter in the same Irish neighborhood butcher shops that have since become parking lots and CVS pharmacies. The oatmeal stretched the meat by nearly half and cost almost nothing. 1 link of white pudding, sliced thin and fried, fed 2 children a full breakfast alongside a piece of griddle bread and a cup of tea. Grandma just called it the pudding. She never needed more of a name than that, and neither did anyone else who ate it. Number 29, oat and onion stuffing. Not bread stuffing, not the stuffing that comes in a bag. Oats, rolled oats, toasted in a dry pan for 5 minutes until they turned the color of hazelnuts and smelled of warm grain, combined with onions that had been cooked slow in lard until they were translucent and sweet, seasoned with salt and fresh thyme from the window box, bound with just enough water to hold together. Used to fill a chicken or pack around a small piece of pork shoulder, or simply spooned into a baking dish and cooked alongside the roast until the top crisped and the oats absorbed all the fat dripping from the meat above. In Irish immigrant kitchens in the 1910s and 1920s, oats were cheaper than bread and more calorie-dense per penny. The stuffing stretched a bird that might otherwise have fed 4 into a meal for 6. Nothing about that calculation was accidental. Every decision in these kitchens was a calculation, and every calculation was made by a woman who had already done it 100 times before and knew exactly how far each ingredient would go. Number 28, Colcannon cakes. The leftover colcannon from Sunday formed into patties Monday morning. Potato and cabbage, pressed flat, laid into a cast iron pan with a scrape of lard, fried until the outside crackled dark and the inside stayed soft and steaming. You could hear them from the next room, that particular hiss and pop of cold potato hitting hot fat. In Hell's Kitchen in 1915, a head of cabbage cost 3 cents. Nothing was wasted. Not a single leaf. Not a single cold spoonful left in the pot. That is not poverty cooking. That is a kind of precision and discipline that modern kitchens, with their refrigerators and their weekly grocery runs, have completely forgotten how to practice. Number 27, soda bread griddle cakes. Not the round loaf with the cross cut into the top. That came later for the bakeries, for the church socials, for the version of Irish food that was acceptable to show the neighbors. This was the original. Flat, cooked directly on a cast-iron griddle over a gas flame, no oven required. Flour, baking soda, buttermilk, salt, mixed with as few strokes as possible, dropped by the spoonful onto a hot, dry griddle, flipped once when the edges set. A batch cost under 4 cents in South Boston in 1910 and was made in 15 minutes on a Tuesday morning, before anyone else in the building was awake. The griddle version didn't survive because it wasn't pretty. It didn't slice neatly. It didn't look like something worth keeping. Everything that wasn't pretty got left behind. Number 26. Oatmeal bread, not soda bread, not a yeast loaf. Something older and more particular, a dense, dark loaf made with a combination of oat flour and coarse wheat flour, leavened with baking soda, deepened with a spoon of blackstrap molasses, baked slow and low in a moderate oven for 50 minutes until the crust hardened and cracked along the top, and the center stayed close and slightly sticky when you pressed it. It kept for 4 days without going stale, 5 in the winter when the air was dry and cold. 1 loaf, a family, 5 days of bread from a single bake on Monday morning. In Irish immigrant households in Philadelphia and Baltimore in the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s, oatmeal bread was simply the bread. Nobody called it by a name that required explanation. Nobody wrote the recipe down. It was not considered a recipe. It was considered a basic fact of being a household, as necessary and unremarkable as water. Of course you made oatmeal bread. What else would you make? The question never occurred to anyone until the generation arrived that didn't know how to make it and had no one left to ask.
Number 25. Yellow pea soup with a bacon bone. The bone went in first.
A leftover ham hock or a bare bacon bone with almost nothing left on it, dropped into cold water and brought slowly to a simmer over low heat. Then the split yellow peas, rinsed, poured in by the fistful, watched as they softened and swelled and began to lose their edges. Onion. Salt, a bay leaf if there was one hanging in the kitchen. It cooked for 3 hours, low and patient, until the peas dissolved completely and the soup became something almost solid. Something that trembled in the bowl and smelled like the whole building knew what was happening on the 3rd floor. In the Bronx tenements of the 19s, split peas cost 3 cents a pound. 1 pot fed a family for 2 days. Campbell's Soup Company began mass-producing condensed pea soup in 1897. Their version was a salted, flattened approximation of what Irish and Eastern European immigrant women had been making in tenement kitchens for 2 decades. They sold it back to those same neighborhoods at 10 cents a can. 3 times the cost of making the real thing from scratch, with a quarter of the nutrition and none of the bone broth collagen that made the homemade version genuinely restorative. Grandma just called it the soup. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 24. Boiled bacon and cabbage. Not corned beef. That needs to be said clearly, and it needs to be said once. Corned beef and cabbage was not the Irish immigrant dish. It was a substitution made in the Jewish delicatessens on the Lower East Side, where Irish and Jewish immigrant neighborhoods overlapped and corned beef was available, and back bacon was not. The real dish, the one carried across the Atlantic in the muscles and the memory, was boiled back bacon with cabbage. Salted pork shoulder, soaked overnight in cold water to pull the excess salt, then simmered for 2 slow hours with a head of green cabbage cut into thick quarters. The cabbage softened until it was almost translucent, the broth it all produced. Pink-tinged, savory, faintly sweet from the cabbage, was poured over yesterday's bread in a separate bowl. Nothing was left in the pot. In 1905, back bacon cost 6 cents a pound. Corned beef cost 9. The choice was economic. The taste was something else entirely. They knew things about what slow-cooked salted pork does to a pot of cabbage water that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 23. Boxty. Half the potato raw, half the potato cooked. That was the secret, and it was not obvious, and most people never figured it out without being shown by someone who had been shown by someone else. Raw potato, grated fine on a box grater and squeezed bone dry in a cloth until the liquid wrinkled, combined with an equal amount of mashed potatoes still warm from the pot. A handful of flour. 1 egg, a pour of milk mixed until just combined. The raw starch in the grated potato bound the whole mixture without needing additional flour, and when it hit the hot fat, something happened that plain mashed potato pancakes cannot replicate. A crust that formed quickly and stayed crisp, an interior that was dense and slightly chewy, with a faint sweetness from the raw potato starch caramelizing in the pan. In Pittsburgh and Cleveland, in the neighborhoods near the coal and steel works where Irish immigrant families had settled in the 1910s and 1920s, boxty was Sunday morning food. Made in large batches on a cast iron griddle, stacked on a plate in the center of the table, eaten with butter or nothing at all. A batch for 6 cost under 5 cents. Today it appears on brunch menus labeled potato rosti or crispy potato cake at $16 a plate, served with creme fraiche and microgreens and no acknowledgement of where the technique came from.
Number 22. Brochen Fulchep.
This soup appears in Irish manuscripts from the 8th century, written down by monks in monasteries along the western coast, when most of Europe was still working out how to cook grain into something edible. Leeks, oatmeal, butter, and broth. That was it. That was all it had ever been. The leeks went in first, softened in butter until they collapsed into sweet green silk. Then the oatmeal, stirred in to thicken. Then the broth, water from a boiled bone, or simply salted water if there was nothing else. Simmered until the oatmeal swelled and the whole pot became thick and warm and smelling of leek and fat. Irish immigrant women carried this recipe across the Atlantic in the 1880s and 1890s and made it in 400-square-foot tenement apartments in the mill towns of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where leeks cost 2 cents a bunch at the pushcart markets, and oatmeal was already sitting in the pantry for the morning stirabout. It never made it to a restaurant menu. It was too plain-looking, too honest about what it was. The food that survives from these kitchens is the food that photographs well and sounds romantic when you describe it. Brochen Fulchep is an 8th century leek and oatmeal soup made in a tenement. It never had a chance. Number 21. Treacle bread, dark soda bread made with blackstrap molasses in place of sugar. The color of strong coffee left too long on the stove. Dense, with a slight bitterness that cut through the fat, and a crust that crackled when you broke it, and a center that stayed moist and almost sticky for 3 full days. In Irish Catholic parishes in Chicago and Detroit in the 1920s, a pint of blackstrap molasses cost 4 cents. A loaf of treacle bread cost less than a nickel total to produce and lasted a family through the working week. Blackstrap molasses, the dark, final product of the sugar refining process, delivers iron, calcium, manganese, and B vitamins in concentrations that rival many commercial supplements. Irish immigrant women whose families could not afford meat kept their children's iron levels stable with treacle bread and didn't know the scientific name for what they were doing. They just knew the children were better when they ate it. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 20. Cockle and mussel stew. Women from the coastal counties, Clare, Galway, Cork, Kerry, knew shellfish the way women from inland counties knew turnips and parsnips. They arrived in American port cities and found the same shellfish living in the same kind of harbor, and they kept cooking. Cockles and mussels, bought from street carts or gathered at low tide, steamed open in a wide pot with chopped onion, a pour of water, and a handful of flat parsley. The liquid the shellfish released as they opened was the broth. Nothing added, nothing needed. The broth tasted of the ocean and the onion and the iron of the shells themselves. In the immigrant neighborhoods of Boston and Baltimore in the 1890s and early 1900s, cockles were sold from street carts for a penny a cup. The fishing families ate the ones that didn't sell. Nothing went back to the sea that could go into a pot. Today the French call a version of this moules marinières, mussels steamed in white wine, and serve it in bistros at $22 a bowl. Grandma used water. The bowl tasted the same. Number 19. Nettle soup. They picked them from the edges of vacant lots and the strips of green beside rail yards in early spring, before anything else had come up from the ground. Stinging nettles, dark green and sharp-leaved, gathered with a cloth wrapped around the hands or simply picked quickly before the sting had time to register. Brought home in an apron. Blanched for 2 minutes in boiling water, which killed the sting instantly and left the leaves soft and dark and smelling of something wild and mineral. then cooked down with onion, potato, and whatever stock or bone water was in the pot. The result was a soup the color of deep forest, green so dark it was almost black, with a flavor that tasted like the earth waking up in April. Nettles cost nothing in immigrant neighborhoods because nobody else wanted them. They delivered iron, protein, and vitamin K in amounts that rival spinach and kale. In the spring of 1903, 1904, 1905, in the springs of every year that an Irish immigrant family was getting by on almost nothing, nettle soup appeared on the table when the ground gave it up for free. Grandma just called it spring soup. The rest of America called it weeds and walked past. Number 18. Pig's feet and cabbage. The butcher saved them for the Irish neighborhoods because nobody else in the city was asking for them. Pig's feet sold for almost nothing in New York and Boston markets in the early 1900s because the trade in premium cuts had already moved on. Simmered in a wide pot for 4 hours with a head of cabbage, a whole onion, and a fist of black pepper. After 4 hours, the collagen had dissolved entirely from the feet into the broth, and the meat pulled away from the small bones in soft, yielding ribbons. The liquid cooled overnight and set to a trembling jelly. That jelly became the base for the next day's soup, melted down with water and whatever vegetable was cheapest in the market. Every celebrated chef in America who now puts pig's feet on a fine dining menu and calls it nose to tail or whole animal cooking is describing something that Irish immigrant grandmothers were doing in tenement kitchens because they had no choice and because wasting any part of an animal would have meant someone went hungry. The grandmothers didn't get a philosophy out of it. They got dinner. Number 17. Oat and onion stuffing. Not bread stuffing. Not the stuffing that comes in a bag. Oats, rolled oats, toasted in a dry pan for 5 minutes until they turned the color of hazelnuts and smelled of warm grain, combined with onions that had been cooked slow in lard until they were translucent and sweet, seasoned with salt and fresh thyme from the window box, bound with just enough water to hold together. Used to fill a chicken or pack around a small piece of pork shoulder, or simply spooned into a baking dish and cooked alongside the roast until the top crisped and the oats absorbed all the fat dripping from the meat above. In Irish immigrant kitchens in the 1910s and 1920s, oats were cheaper than bread and more calorie-dense per penny. The stuffing stretched a bird that might otherwise have fed 4 into a meal for 6. Nothing about that calculation was accidental. Every decision in these kitchens was a calculation, and every calculation was made by a woman who had already done it 100 times before and knew exactly how far each ingredient would go. Number 16. Carrageen moss pudding. Carrageen is a type of red algae, Irish moss, harvested from the rocks along the Atlantic coast at low tide. Dried, it turned pale gold and nearly odorless, and could be stored for months. A small handful, simmered in a pint of milk for 20 minutes, released a natural gelatin that set the milk into a soft, trembling pudding with a texture between panna cotta and yogurt. No commercial gelatin, no cornstarch, no added thickener of any kind, just this carrageen doing what it had always done. Sweetened with a spoon of sugar, flavored with a strip of lemon peel or a pinch of nutmeg, poured into a bowl or a teacup to set. Irish immigrant women in New England in the 1880s and 1890s could find dried carrageen in the Irish import shops of Boston and Providence. It was sold partly as food and partly as medicine, recommended by immigrant community healers for chest complaints, respiratory congestion, and digestive weakness, all of which it helped in ways that food science would not explain for another 50 years. The pharmaceutical industry later isolated carrageenan from the plant and began using it as an industrial food thickener and stabilizer. They patented the commercial extraction process in the 1930s and made significant money from it. Grandma had been doing essentially the same thing in a pot of milk for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody paid her. Number 15. Buttermilk scones. Not the dry, floury wedges sold in coffee chains. not the sweet, crumbling versions loaded with dried fruit and glazed with sugar. These were different, dense, soft, barely sweet, with a tender interior and a crust that was firm but not hard, made with soft wheat flour, a pinch of baking soda, a pinch of salt, and cold buttermilk poured in a slow stream and stirred with as few strokes as possible. The fewer the strokes, the better the scone. Overworking the dough was the only mistake you could make, and Grandma never made it. She knew the moment the dough was ready by how it felt under the heel of her palm. Slightly sticky, not quite smooth, wanting to be left alone. 12 minutes in a moderate oven. Eaten warm within minutes of coming out, with nothing on them or with a scrape of butter that melted into the crust before it had a chance to show. In Irish immigrant kitchens from Boston to San Francisco throughout the 1900s and 1930s, a batch of 12 scones cost less than 6 cents. They were not a treat. They were Tuesday. Number 14, white pudding, a sausage made without blood. The humbler, quieter cousin of black pudding, made when blood was scarce or when the children at the table refused the dark version and needed something they would eat without a fight. Pork meat and fat, chopped fine or ground, combined with oatmeal, diced onion, salt, and white pepper, packed into a natural casing and either poached gently in water or sliced and fried in a pan until the outside blistered and the inside stayed dense and savory and faintly sweet from the oat. Irish immigrant butchers in Boston and New York were making white pudding by the 1880s. Often sold alongside drisheen and black pudding from the same counter in the same Irish neighborhood butcher shops that have since become parking lots and CVS pharmacies. The oatmeal stretched the meat by nearly half and cost almost nothing. One link of white pudding, sliced thin and fried, fed 2 children a full breakfast alongside a piece of griddle bread and a cup of tea. Grandma just called it the pudding. She never needed more of a name than that, and neither did anyone else who ate it. Number 13, dry sheen, the real thing. Darker and more ancient than white pudding, made from sheep's blood, cream, oatmeal, and rendered fat, seasoned with tansy and salt, slow cooked in a casing or a basin until it set firm enough to slice cleanly with a knife. Specific to Cork and the surrounding counties of Munster. Carried to Boston by Cork immigrant families in the 1880s and 1890s, and kept alive in the Irish butcher shops of that city for 2 generations before it disappeared almost entirely from the American market. The sheep's blood cost almost nothing because it was a slaughterhouse byproduct that the commercial meat trade was otherwise discarding into drainage. Irish immigrant women took what was considered waste and made something that sustained a family through a hard week at minimal cost. Today, dry sheen has become a specialty item, found occasionally in Irish import shops, appearing on restaurant menus in Dublin for tourists who want to experience something authentic. American chefs who serve blood sausage on charcuterie boards at $18 for 2 slices call it artisan. They call it a culinary adventure. They do not call it what it is, a recipe that immigrant grandmothers invented from materials no one else wanted, and that those same grandmothers were never credited for keeping alive. Number 12.
Praetiotin.
Mashed potato and raw rolled oats, pressed together with a pinch of salt, formed into flat rounds, and cooked a dry griddle. No fat, no oil, until both sides turned a deep gold and the edges crisped and the smell of toasted oat mixed with hot potato filled the kitchen. 3 ingredients. Under 3 cents in the Scots-Irish Appalachian communities of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky in the early 1900s, where families had been making this since before the American Revolution. This was not an Irish recipe. It was not a Scottish recipe. It was the thing that happened when 2 immigrant traditions, Irish potato culture and Scottish oat culture, arrived in the same mountain hollows and mixed in the kitchens of families who had intermarried across generations and kept the food knowledge of both sides without labeling any of it. The result was something neither country had independently produced. That is not poverty cooking. That is the accidental culinary genius of people with nothing to spare and everything to figure out, working with whatever grew and whatever cost least and whatever their grandmothers had shown them before they left. Number 11. Goody. Stale bread broken into rough pieces in a bowl. Warm milk poured slowly over until the bread softened and swelled and the bowl smelled of warm grain and dairy. A spoon of sugar stirred in, just one, enough to make it something rather than nothing. That was it. Nothing more. No egg, no butter, no flavoring. In Irish immigrant households across the Northeast, from the 1880s through the 1940s, goody was made for sick children whose stomachs couldn't hold anything solid, for elderly grandparents whose teeth had given out, for the last night before payday when the bread had gone hard and there was nothing else in the house that could be stretched further. It cost under 2 cents. It was warm, and it was soft, and it was sweet in the faintest, most honest way, sweet the way something is sweet when sweetness is a gift rather than a given. It was the meal made from almost nothing by a woman who had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that her family was not going to bed hungry. Every immigrant tradition has a version of this meal. Goody was Ireland's answer, and it disappeared without anyone noticing it was gone. Number 10. Colcannon. The original, not the fried cakes, the full dish made right, made properly, made the way it was meant to be made. Potatoes and kale or green cabbage, boiled separately and combined while both were still steaming, mashed together in the pot with a generous knob of butter and a pour of warm milk and a full handful of scallions, the green tops included. The kale gave it a faint bitterness and a deep green streak through the white potato that made it look humble and taste like something that had been thought about for a very long time. You could see where the scallions had been folded in, dark green threads running through the white. In the rural south of Ireland, colcannon was harvest food, made in October when the kale was at its peak, and the new season potatoes had come up from the ground. In Irish immigrant kitchens in New York and Boston in the 1890s and early 1900s, it cost 7 cents to make enough for 6 people, and leftovers became the cakes on Monday and the soup on Tuesday. In 1922, the Irish Folklore Commission documented over 40 regional variations. Today, there is one version in the American memory, served at Irish pub chains in March. It is wrong in almost every particular. The grandmothers would recognize none of it. Number 9. Oatmeal bread. Not soda bread, not a yeast loaf. Something older and more particular. A dense, dark loaf made with a combination of oat flour and coarse wheat flour, leavened with baking soda, deepened with a spoon of blackstrap molasses, baked slow and low in a moderate oven for 50 minutes until the crust hardened and cracked along the top, and the center stayed close and slightly sticky when you pressed it. It kept for 4 days without going stale, 5 in the winter when the air was dry and cold. 1 loaf, a family. 5 days of bread from a single bake on Monday morning. In Irish immigrant households in Philadelphia and Baltimore in the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s, oatmeal bread was simply the bread. Nobody called it by a name that required explanation. Nobody wrote the recipe down. It was not considered a recipe. It was considered a basic fact of being a household, as necessary and unremarkable as water. Of course you made oatmeal bread. What else would you make? The question never occurred to anyone until the generation arrived that didn't know how to make it and had no one left to ask. Number 8. Potato and onion soup. 2 ingredients: a pot of water, a knob of butter, a pinch of salt. The onions went in first, sliced thin, cooked slow in the butter over low heat for 15 minutes until they turned translucent and began to smell sweet and caramelized at the edges. Then the potatoes, diced small, dropped into the pot and covered with water and brought to a slow boil. Simmered for 30 minutes until the potato pieces began to break apart at their edges and cloud the broth naturally and thicken it from the inside. No flour required, no cream added, nothing that cost money and wasn't already in the pot. In Irish immigrant kitchens in Chicago and Detroit in the 1930s, this was the soup made on the last night of the week when the other food was finished and payday was tomorrow. A pot cost 6 cents and lasted 2 days and tasted, depending on the quality of the onion and the patience of the cook, like something considerably more deliberate than it was. The French call a chilled version of this vichyssoise and serve it in small white bowls at $14 an order in restaurants that have white tablecloths. Grandma served it hot, in large bowls, at a table with no cloth. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 3, clam chowder. The bay was always there. That is what makes this story hurt in such a specific way. The water was full of food. Cold Pacific currents carried clams, crab, fish, mussels. Entire ecosystems moving beneath the fog while families on shore struggled to afford dinner. San Francisco in the 1930s smelled like salt water and diesel fuel and sourdough bread cooling in bakery windows. The waterfront was crowded with fishermen from Italian and Portuguese families who understood the bay the way farmers understand weather. They knew where the clams were thickest. They knew which tides mattered. They knew how to turn inexpensive seafood into meals that could carry a working man through another freezing morning on the docks. Clam chowder began as practical food, not trendy food, not tourist food, survival food. You made it because clams were available. Potatoes were cheap, onions kept well, salt pork added fat and flavor. Cream, when you could spare it, transformed the whole thing into something comforting enough to make people forget how cold they were for 20 minutes. A heavy pot of chowder simmering on the stove could feed an entire family. More importantly, it created the illusion of abundance that matters more than modern people realize. Poor communities survive partly on morale. A thin broth feels like scarcity. A thick chowder feels like care. So grandmothers stirred flour into cream and rendered pork fat slowly and stretched every ingredient until the pot became bigger than the sum of its parts. That is culinary intelligence. And then the same ingredients entered the Alcatraz kitchen under a federal budget. Fresh clams, cream, potatoes, aromatics. Prepared in industrial quantities for inmates housed on an island prison sitting directly in the middle of the bay itself. Think about the symbolism there. Fishing families harvested the clams. Working-class labor moved the supplies. Federal money purchased the ingredients. And prisoners consumed a richer version of the meal than some of the families who harvested the food in the first place. That is not satire. That actually happened. Today, people pay absurd amounts of money for authentic San Francisco clam chowder served in sourdough bread bowls overlooking Finwisherman's Wharf. Tourists photograph it like it is cultural theater. But to Depression-era families, chowder was never performance. It was engineering. It was warmth converted into calories. It was a mother trying to make her children feel full before bed. It was fishermen eating something hot after spending 12 hours in freezing wind. It was old-world cooking techniques surviving in tiny kitchens because immigrants carried those recipes across oceans when they had little else. And that knowledge mattered. Those cooks understood layering flavor in stages. They knew salt pork had to render slowly first. They knew potatoes thickened broth naturally if cooked long enough. They knew cheap ingredients could become luxurious if treated patiently. Modern food culture often mistakes expensive ingredients for skill. Depression cooking proved the opposite. Skill was what happened when ingredients were scarce. That is why these meals endure emotionally. They contain memory inside them. A bowl of chowder is not just potatoes and clams. It is waterfront labor, immigration history, family sacrifice, weather, poverty, adaptation, community knowledge. And somewhere inside all of that sits the uncomfortable truth that the federal prison system had enough money to serve rich chowder consistently, while free citizens nearby struggled to justify cream at the grocery counter. People want history to separate neatly into heroes and villains, rich and poor, freedom and punishment. But the Depression blurred those categories into something deeply unsettling. Because sometimes the prison had certainty, and the outside world did not. Number 2, roast beef. Roast beef was never just dinner, it was evidence. Evidence that the week had gone well enough for a family to pause survival mode for one evening and experience something dangerously close to comfort. In working-class America during the 1930s, beef occupied a strange emotional territory. People dreamed about it constantly, but purchased it cautiously. A roast large enough to feed an entire family represented real money. Money that usually had 10 other responsibilities attached to it before anyone even entered the butcher shop. Rent came first. Coal came first. Shoes for the children came first. Medicine came first. A roast happened only when those other emergencies loosened their grip for a moment. That is why Sunday dinners became sacred in so many American households. Not because people were sentimental by nature, but because scarcity turns ordinary pleasures into ceremonies. When a mother carried a roast to the table, everybody understood the significance immediately. You sat straighter, you ate slower. Fathers carved carefully, so every plate looked fair. Vegetables cooked in beef drippings tasted rich enough to make children silent for a few precious minutes. For one meal, the family could pretend abundance was normal. That illusion matters more than historians sometimes acknowledge. Human beings need psychological nourishment, almost as much as physical nourishment. A roast dinner said, "Things may still be hard, but tonight we are together and nobody is leaving hungry." Then there was Alcatraz. Roast beef appeared there not as celebration, but as scheduling. Tuesday, Thursday, rotation menu, institutional routine. The prison kitchen browned massive cuts of beef, let carrots and onions soften in rendered drippings, thickened gravies from pan scrapings, and served complete hot meals to inmates according to federally approved nutrition standards. Again, people misunderstand why this shocks us. It is not because prisoners ate food. It is because millions of free Americans could not reliably access the same quality of protein with the same consistency. The government understood that morale affected prison control. Well-fed inmates were easier to manage. Predictable meals reduced conflict. Nutrition protected labor capacity and institutional order, so the state invested accordingly. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, entire regions of America survived on beans, cornbread, potatoes, and whatever meat flavoring could be stretched across the week. Some families used a single ham hock repeatedly until there was almost nothing left but bone. Others relied on gravy to imitate richness. Children learned to chew slowly because it made meals last longer. And then newspapers printed stories about Alcatraz serving roast beef. Imagine reading that while standing in a bread line. Imagine hearing that while cutting mold from yesterday's loaf. Imagine explaining to your children why convicted bank robbers ate better protein than they did. People today often reduce the depression to black and white photographs and vague stories about hardship. But food exposes the emotional reality underneath the statistics. You can measure inequality very clearly by asking a simple question: who got meat and how often? At Alcatraz, the answer was institutionalized regularity. Outside Alcatraz, the answer depended on luck. And yet the women cooking in those struggling households still managed miracles. They browned onions to deepen flavor. They turned drippings into gravy. They stretched vegetables beneath the roast so nothing was wasted. They created beauty inside limitation. That deserves more respect than it gets, because real cooking is not excess. Real cooking is transformation. And nobody transformed scarcity more skillfully than Depression-era mothers standing over heavy ovens, trying to make one roast feel large enough to hold an entire family together for another week. Number 1, ice cream, actual ice cream. Not frozen flavored syrup, not shaved ice. Not the watered-down, homemade versions families sometimes improvised when money disappeared and children still wanted something sweet during the summer heat. Real ice cream. Cream, sugar, eggs, vanilla, churned frozen, served cold enough to feel luxurious. This is the detail that pulls the entire Alcatraz story into focus because ice cream was never nutritionally necessary. Nobody argued that inmates required it for survival. Bread was survival. Beans were survival. Potatoes were survival. Ice cream existed entirely in the category of morale, comfort, pleasure, humanity, and that is exactly why it matters. During the Great Depression, most American families organized their grocery spending around necessity alone. Every nickel had an assignment before it even entered the house: flour, lard, salt, coffee if the week had gone well enough, sugar carefully rationed because children still deserved birthdays even during hard times. A quart of commercial ice cream cost roughly 25 cents in the 1930s. That number sounds tiny now, but during the Depression, 25 cents could represent an entire day's food budget for multiple people. For many households, ice cream sat outside the boundaries of realistic possibility. It became celebration food, holiday food, memory food. Children remembered the rare occasions they got ice cream with startling precision decades later because scarcity brands joy into the mind differently. They remembered the flavor, the weather, the exact shape of the cone. They remembered how slowly they ate it because they already understood, even as children, that the experience would not return anytime soon. Some families stretched one small serving among several children. Others made homemade versions with less cream and more ice, hoping the children would not notice the difference. Parents became experts at manufacturing delight from almost nothing because disappointment had become too common inside American homes. And meanwhile, inside the most notorious federal prison in the country, inmates received actual ice cream on scheduled rotations, Sundays, holidays, institutional dessert service. The government recorded it plainly in kitchen logs, almost casually, as though this were entirely ordinary. Maybe that is the strangest part of all, the calmness of it. Nobody inside the prison administration considered ice cream controversial. They considered it practical. A content inmate population was easier to manage. Better meals reduced unrest. Small comforts stabilized institutional behavior. So ice cream remained on the menu while free families outside prison walls counted pennies beside grocery shelves, trying to decide whether butter or kerosene mattered more that week. Think about the emotional contradiction buried inside that reality. A child in rural Kansas might spend 6 months dreaming about ice cream, while a convicted criminal on Alcatraz received it according to schedule, not because he earned it, not because he deserved it morally, but because the federal system believed psychological stability inside prison had administrative value. And maybe that is what unsettles people most about Depression-era America. The government clearly understood the relationship between dignity and food quality. They just applied that understanding selectively. Because ice cream is not really about dessert. It is about what a society considers acceptable